Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 540, and today I'm joined by Brad Pearce. He is the Wayward Rabbler on Substack, so go and subscribe to Substack. He has a really big, Substack there. It's over 1,000 subscribers, so congratulations on that. That's a really huge number, and something to really be proud of. And also, you are a part of the team at the Libertarian Institute now. You've written, I don't know how many, at least a half dozen columns for us, maybe quite a few more by this point. And so, very happy to have you on with us at the Institute, which is, of course, where I'm the news editor and host this show. So, Brad, welcome to Conflicts of Interest.
Hi, thank you for having me on. Just quickly, it's the Wayward Rabbler, Rabbler. Almost everyone gets that wrong for some reason. Anyway, yeah, and I've been Scott brought me on at the Libertarian Institute in August, and I've probably written about a dozen articles since then, so it's been really good.
Oh, man, time is just flying by. It does not seem like I've been reading your stuff in the Institute for, 6 months here. But, congratulations, yeah. And again, happy to have you on the team. So, one of the articles that you wrote for us at the Institute, Western media's blackout of Israel's Hannibal directive, really goes over a lot of what happened on October 7th and what the narrative has come out of that day and what it should be. And one of the reasons I want to have you on today to talk about this is, initially after October 7th and really for the first month after, I really believed that Israel probably killed some number of Israelis on October 7th, but these were not situations where the Israeli government had necessarily ordered the killing of civilians, but rather, individual soldiers who are scared, young 18, 19, 20-year-olds in combat for the first time, and rather than take a chance, they pull the trigger and kill some civilians, or, a helicopter hits a car or a house that causes it to collapse and 10 people die in the basement or something like that. These kinds of tragedies that you really couldn't lay at the feet of Tel Aviv. But, going from the initial narrative of 1,400 dead Israeli civilians, and this included raped women, beheaded babies, mutilated corpses, and all kinds of other absolutely animal-like atrocities that they alleged were committed by Hamas, painted this picture that basically Gaza had turned into a wild zoo, and Israel essentially had to go in there and put the animals down in order to, regain order and to make themselves safe, or else, their women could just be standing on the street corner or going to a concert and, be mass raped at any point in time. And so, this is the narrative that seems to have prevailed, and it's just completely incorrect now that we see, it seems that a substantial number of Israeli civilians were killed, and certainly not the 1,400 that were initially reported, as many as 700, but a substantial number of those were killed by the Israeli military and at the orders of the Israeli military command. So, let's just go over, this whole narrative thing and what actually happened on October 7th. So I'll let you start there.
Okay, well, we don't really have any numbers about, who was killed. The Ynet article that we'll be talking about plenty said that they destroyed 70 cars returning to Gaza, sometimes killing all of the inhabitants or the occupants, not, knowing who was in them. But yeah, I mean, the first really clear story of friendly fire deaths that came out was, the helicopters trying to get the Nova Music Festival situation under control. And that is very much, like you said, it's like an in the heat of the battle, accidentally killing civilians sort of thing. There's not necessarily anyone on Israel's side that should be punished for that happening. And, that's just the sort of thing that does happen when there's conflict in a civilian area. What then came out was that there's what was called at the Kibbutz Berry at what's called Pessy's house. They had this situation where there were 40 Hamas militants in the house and 14 Israeli hostages, and basically one Hamas guy ran out and released a hostage to tell them, there are 14 Israelis in here, don't shell the house. And they decided to shell it with two what they call light tank shells anyway, whatever that means. And one Israeli inside survived, and then the one that got released survived, and both of them told the same story, that Israel knew there were hostages in there and that 14 of them died. So that one came out pretty fast, but even that could be one bad call by one commander in a stressful situation, which would be more the individual commander would be the one that should get punished for that, not Tel Aviv, not the Netanyahu government. But it came out with this huge Ynet, investigation, which is Israel's largest news website. They call it like Israel's #1 web portal, and it's the main like working class news website in Israel. And they released this huge investigation that showed not only just absolutely insane levels of incompetence from Israel's government from the beginning of this. They basically, because of, their hubris and their bad plans and over-reliance on technology, they just were not at all prepared for this kind of breach. Their entire defense was based on, like Hamas popping up from a tunnel and, capturing a few people or whatever. And so even 6 hours into the attack, they had no idea what's going on. And around that time, an order went out IDF-wide, according to what Ynet was able to discover, that said that their priority was stopping any hostages from going back to Gaza at any cost, which is similar to something it's similar to a public understanding of something called the Hannibal Directive. However, the Hannibal Directive was basically an order from the 80s that the idea is that if a soldier's captured, that you try to stop them. Even if it might put the soldier at risk. It at no point ever authorized the intentional killing of any Israeli citizen or soldier. It never applied to civilians at all. But they issued some sort of mass Hannibal Directive on steroids that said kill anything, to stop anyone from getting taken back. And then from there, it explains so much because for me, I cover a lot of like narratives and messaging and, what the media is telling us, what countries want us to believe and that sort of thing. So from the start, I just couldn't figure out, why is Israel's messaging so incredibly bad? Why are they focusing on these weird, really specific atrocity stories like, this baby being cooked in an oven, 40 babies beheaded alive, a baby cut out of the womb, later, they cut off a woman's breast and they played with it, like all this weird stuff, all of which got debunked pretty quickly and all of which Israel supporters held on to after it was debunked. Why are they doing this when what Hamas actually did, was so bad? And as it turns out, they clearly had to cover the fact that Israel caused an absolutely unacceptable amount of civilian casualties. And this also explains why they were so weird about not trying hard enough to get the hostages back, because if they get the hostages back, there's a risk that any of them are going to say, Israel bombed our car when we were getting driven back to getting driven back to Gaza. And that's exactly what Tel Aviv does not want them to say.
Right. Yeah. So I think that is, a really important point in all of this, is that was a part of the narrative control, not only how far it lets them go in Gaza, but what you could actually question of what Israel did on October 7th is Hamas is committing all these awful atrocities. We have to get 4 months down the road before the mainstream media has even begun to debunk those to get to what actually happened on October 7th. Now, that is really unfortunate. It seems that, pretty recently we had this news that the New York Times pulled an episode of their daily podcast, and there's some questions about the main New York Times piece on the sexual violence committed on October 7th. And, I want to give you a shout out here because, I think from the beginning, you've really been trying to break all this down, particularly on your Ets account. If you want to let everybody know what your handle is after this, you should do that. Because, you got a lot of heat for it, and it's a dangerous thing to try to claim that, basically this mass rape didn't happen because we're supposed to believe all women and stuff like that. So do you want to talk about that part of the narrative at all?
Okay, yeah. So firstly, my X account is at Wayward Rabbler. But anyway, regarding all of that, it was suspicious to me from the first place. So as soon as I saw this guy, Yossi Landau, who works for this rescue organization, Zaka, you're talking in an interview with Channel 24, which is the super pro-Netanyahu channel in Israel, I just knew things about it were wrong. I have a pretty good sense for this sort of thing. So I started to look into it and, found out that this organization is has an extremely sordid history. I published a 14,000 word investigation on it just by October 18th, that it took Haaretz until January 31st to publish and say the same thing that I said, which is that they're not a credible source on any of this information, that no one, especially Newswire service or mainstream news, should be citing them regarding any matter. And it's crazy because I used Haaretz's previous reporting really heavily in that investigation. And so they knew from the beginning that they couldn't be trusting these people and that they were going to have to ultimately retract it. So, yeah, I mean, I went forward with that from the beginning, and I was kind of scared writing that, honestly, because it's not a popular thing to write an article attacking a rescue organization after a mass casualty event. But the corruption was so extreme that once I saw what was going on, I absolutely couldn't resist. And, that took some time to get noticed. But then I got wise that this Ynet story was coming out because Max Blumenthal shared a preview of it. And so then when that came out, I was the first person to outline it in English because there's still a total, media blackout on it. So even searching for the name of it and the publication, you would only find my X thread on it, that I only was able to find the article because of Max. And, it's a funny thing because there's a whole I shouldn't say cottage industry, but there's this common shtick where people, like Brian Grimm's getting criticized for it right now, where they make some random claim like, oh, no one in the media is talking about how voters are uncomfortable with Joe Biden's age. And it's like, what are you talking about? Everyone, tons of people are talking about it. The only reason the media is not talking about it more is because absolutely everyone knows that Joe Biden is a decrepit old man. It's not that interesting of news. But in this instance with, the Hannibal Directive story, like I went through on that Libertarian Institute article, I went to the actual, to Google News and searched the term. I went to America's top publications and searched the term, and I was able to show that it wasn't there. I mean, that's what a true media blackout looks like. And as I keep saying, at this point, every major publication in the United States needs a specific Haaretz reporter, or, like Israel media reporter, I should say, whose job it is specifically just to cover what these major mainstream Israeli publications are publishing, because Israel, for its problems, has a very robust media environment. They have some very good newspapers. They have some very, very good journalists. They've had excellent, debate in their opinion pages since October 7th. But they don't want Americans to see any of this, despite the fact that we can just as easily go to Haaretz.com and, see what Israel's reporting about the misdeeds of its own government.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think at antiwar.com, we've probably run editorials from Haaretz as the spotlight article more than any other outlet since October 7th. And so there is really good and important content and opinion on these sites. A lot of other really important news that Haaretz has covered. Like recently, they exposed that the Israeli military has actually given orders to their soldiers to burn down houses after they occupy them in Gaza, and just numerous stories like that. So, yeah, I think you're right about that. I try to make sure that I read most of the headlines at Haaretz every day and keep up, especially with all their exclusive and breaking stories, because there are a lot of important things that you will read there that you will never read in the English media. And one of the reasons is at our outlets we have pretty incomplete narrative control. In fact, some CNN staffers recently went to The Guardian and complained about how their editors made them, contextualize every single article about the atrocities committed in Gaza with, well, this is all Hamas's fault, and it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for October 7th. So we have to remember that.
Yeah, did you see there was just an article in The Intercept about Axel Springer, the huge German publishing conglomerate that owns like Der Welt and Bild and Business Insider. They apparently have a specific pledge within their organization that all of their employees have to support Israel, to work for the paper in any capacity. And, they're really involved in Israel and German and American media. And, that's just one particularly egregious example that is getting exposed currently. But, something that does need to be pointed out is that it's not even necessarily a conspiracy. It's that people become the editors of major publications because they know which way the wind's blowing, and they have a good eye for what they're allowed to say and what their corporate masters want and everything like that. So it's not like a central directive goes out about this I mean, for the most part, they just kind of wait to see if the New York Times will cover something, and if the New York Times doesn't, then they just don't touch something that's really controversial, like the Hannibal Directive.
Right. There's a really good interview of Noam Chomsky where he points this out. Some mainstream hack is asking him, like, oh, so you're saying I only got my job because I'm controlled? And he said, no, you just go along with the narrative. That's why you have the job, not that you bend your opinions to what you should want, just that they know you're going to form your opinions the right way.
Yeah, you got the job because you don't need to be controlled.
But that said, there have even been cases in CNN, like the mass destruction of cemeteries in Gaza, where the IDF gave an Israeli journalist a guided tour of the cemetery and gave him all this proof that he just assumed the CNN reporter would go and take to his audience as, oh my God, Hamas is using cemeteries. They're literally using the bones of their ancestors to attack Israel, and that's why they had to dig up all these cemeteries, which you would think would be a particular offense to Americans, something we should be sensitive to, given how that, was such a big part of our genocide of the American Indians. But never mind all of that, Israel racing the graves and cemeteries. CNN even says that no, there were no Hamas tunnels under that cemetery. That was a pretty wild story to see. But back to the October 7th stuff. We don't have numbers and figures, or you don't have an estimate, I guess, on what percentage of the civilians killed were actually killed by the IDF versus Hamas. And I think it's important to mention here that there were hundreds of Israeli soldiers killed on October 7th.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important part of the whole narrative, is from Hamas's perspective, if they want to present this as essentially a military operation where they break through a wall and they take hostages, because in the past 20 years, the one thing Hamas has been able to have any political leverage with on Israel's is, either the bodies of or hostages of Israelis. And so that, kind of makes sense strategically. So I'm just wondering if you have any idea on those numbers.
I would just say I'm not so much of a numbers person in general. I think it can sometimes get in the way of understanding the bigger picture. But there are two things. I mean, there are a few things I would say about that. The first of which is that according to that Ynet report, they said there were at least tenfold as many random looters that broke through, which would be 20,000 people. So, some of those videos, like the Thai agricultural worker being decapitated, were just random, I don't know, whoever, the dregs of society breaking out of Gaza. Basically the most irresponsible people in their society, are the ones that would go running out when the fence was breached. And then regarding the civilians, I would say that we know at least 10 of them were Shin Bet agents, which, is like Israel's FBI or whatever. So that does not really fairly count as a civilian on our normal understanding of it. And then further, how many of these civilians were like Israelis that, picked up their own gun to go defend their homes, which is, of course, like honorable from their perspective. It's just quite a bit different from slaughtering some unarmed person. So even, among the civilians that were killed by Hamas or were killed by other Palestinians, we really don't know. And, I don't think we'll ever get a fair accounting of it. I mean, it's obvious that, conducting an operation of the size that Hamas did, that a good number of civilians, were going to get killed. But we should assume that, anyone that wasn't in uniform, that was doing something of no military utility, wasn't Hamas. Like, for example, in that ridiculous New York Times story with the thing with the woman getting her breast cut off and, kicked around or whatever, they said it was 5 men in civilian clothing getting into a van. So just from that description, we can assume that wasn't Hamas, who are usually uniformed military and were on a mission, not just committing random atrocities. Not that I believe that story at all. So we'll see. The other thing is, we don't know how many of the people killed were actually the Palestinians that went rushing out of Gaza that then were found. I mean, it doesn't help with the numbers, but Max Blumenthal said something really interesting on the Scott Horton show, which is that in Gaza, just culturally, everyone wears long pants all the time, no matter, how warm it is or whatever. So that, if the civilians that they found, like, wearing jeans were almost definitely Palestinians, because the Israelis would have been wearing shorts in, that type of warm weather. They're basically like in a desert or whatever. So yeah, I don't know if we'll be able to say, but one way or another, a lot of civilians died in political violence that day.
Yeah. And I guess, another point to all of this is the number of children killed. I believe that the number of under 18-year-olds killed on October 7th is actually under 40, which, really threw a lot of cold water on the 40 dead babies. Yeah. And my understanding is the only baby that was killed, I say baby as anyone under
Infant.
the age of 1, what was killed in a car seat, when the car was fired upon, which, is something that is an absolute war crime and an atrocity that was committed by Hamas on October 7th. But this was, when I saw a video of this on October 7th, it was something that didn't surprise me at all. One of the chief complaints of Palestinians is that the Israelis set up all these checkpoints across the West Bank, and if any Palestinian drives at them too quickly, they mow the Palestinian and anyone in the car along with them down, just open fire on it. And so, this seemed to me, whether it was upon orders or not, just a group of young members of Hamas attempting to, enact on the Israelis what has been enacted on so many Palestinians. That's not in any way to try to justify it, but just, say, this is something that you would kind of almost assume would happen if Hamas were able to gain control over a kibbutz for a couple hours.
Well, the other thing about this is that Israel's narrative is that the IDF is the most moral army in the world and that Hamas are terrorists, yet they constantly use the justification of like, oh, well, this is what Hamas would do to us. And it's like, well, okay, I don't understand how you think that's relevant.
And it's looking like the ratio of civilians killed in the Israeli military operations in Gaza is going to be, even if every single civilian killed on October 7th was killed by Hamas.
Oh, yeah.
Israel, not just quantity more, but percentage wise, is going to kill far, a greater number of percentage of civilians than Hamas did on October 7th. And that's with counting almost every single man that's been killed as a member of Hamas, which just seems absurd. Maybe it's 10% or lower. I mean, the bombing campaign seems pretty indiscriminate, and the Hamas members are probably the only ones that really have the shelters to survive it with their, hundreds of miles of tunnel networks.
Yeah, well, as Westerners, we've been propagandized our entire lives to believe that airstrikes are somehow more humane than other forms of mass murder, which obviously is not actually true.
Yeah, well, especially when you're just talking about bullets versus bombs, there are certain, things that I think offend the sensibilities a little bit more if you're talking about like knives or beating people to death or something like that. But, if you're just talking about gunfights and things like that, then bombing is probably actually far more tragic and gruesome, and a lot of people end up getting crushed under the rubble, not, just instantly vaporized or are killed by the bomb. So, what else are we missing on the October 7th stuff that we really haven't gotten into yet?
I mean, I would just say that most specifically, that once again, I think the biggest thing is that they're very much trying to distract people from the totally unacceptable amount of civilian casualties, and that's why their messaging has been so confused and all over the place. And that's why they've been, so quick to accuse people of things and to demand that we believe whichever new crazy story they come up with. And it is clearly the case, that for a long time we thought Israel was very good at propaganda. And, I find that we were wrong about that. The Western media just covers for them an extraordinary amount. So Americans don't, understand what's going on. It's really an unfortunate thing.
Yeah, well, I guess the good news on that is we do have social media now, and even before the ICJ ruling, a third of Americans thought Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza. Now, 16% of conservatives agreed, and they might have all been for the genocide. They just acknowledge it's happening. But 50% of people who voted for Biden in 2020, 50% of young Americans almost 50% of Hispanic Americans, over 50% of liberals, all believe this is a genocide, and they're the ones out there protesting and genocide, Joe. And the cracking of all this narrative is really important, because I think the only thing that could end the military operations at this point is Joe Biden pulling the plug. And the only thing that's going to force him to do that is that he's, confronted with so much bad polling and so many genocide Joe chants, he feels he has no choice.
Yeah, I don't actually think that the American government is going to be responsive to the American people on this, and B, I don't think that U.S. support of Israel is nearly as important as people think it is. Israel is a much wealthier country than those around them. It has a very heavily militarized population. It does rely on us for some things, but at most it's going to slow them down. The United States does give Israel a lot of cover in international organizations like the UN, but at the same time, Israel goes in front of those places and accuses them all of being Nazis, basically. So they really clearly don't care. And I don't know. I don't know that. I think what's most likely to stop it is the Israelis themselves. Netanyahu's government is extremely unpopular. There's huge protests all the time. He was embattled before. He's still on trial for corruption as this is ongoing. And they are not showing the concern for the hostages that they should, and have presumably killed God knows how many of them in these airstrikes. So I think what's most likely to stop this is the Israelis themselves.
Interesting. I guess one of the reasons I would disagree is there's also a lot of pressure on Israel to go further. And there's protests, and the Israeli civilians are part of the reason there's an aid blockage going into Gaza. They're out there protesting and holding up the aid trucks from getting into the starving people of Gaza. So, there are some real radicals, and a lot of them within the Israeli society now, that, it's not clear to me that just, if you get rid of Netanyahu, that this winds down or anything like that. Even the kind of more moderate figures like a Benny Gantz or a Yair Lapid are still pretty absolute lunatics, and any government that has a Itamar Ben-Gvir or Betel Smotrich is going to be pretty far right wing. When we look back at what happened on October 7th, of course, everybody in the United States likes to pretend that, nothing was going on before this was the breaking of a ceasefire. But if you go back to antiwar.com and read Dave DeCamp from December of 2022, when the Netanyahu government was getting formed, there were warnings at the time going out that, hey, he is adopting a really right-wing government. They are taking a lot of power in the West Bank, and this is going to cause a problem with the Palestinians.
Yes, well, exactly. But see, here's the thing about all of this, is that Netanyahu's government is reliant on these specific far-right lunatics that are extreme minorities in Israel society. Ben-Gvir, the house he lives in is illegal under Israeli law, because it's, in an illegal outpost. And so instead of arresting the radical settlers that are actually terrorists, that often go on trial for inciting racial hatred and that sort of thing, they, sent their military there to protect the West Bank Palestinians from them, because, they didn't want the situation to escalate, when they could have just been arresting the settlers, the settlers that were committing acts of violence. And this is also true of the people that are blocking aid coming into Gaza. So, a different government could just arrest these people who are in fact breaking the law. But, Netanyahu's government can't, because he's reliant on them for support, and, to keep his shaky government going, that he needs to be in power so he doesn't go to prison for corruption. So, it's all a mess. And really, Israel's kind of unique form of government guarantees that you get a lot of nut jobs in there, and then, all the political horse trading and everything else. But regardless, his government's very weak, and there's a lot of people that think Israel needs to take a drastic change of direction. For one thing, this is a society that based everything on security, not on, cooperation. They did some work with some of the other states, but that was basically so they could keep being so aggressive towards the Palestinians. But, their security model has failed drastically. And this is after 60 years of making everyone be in the IDF, or more than 60 years of making everyone be in the IDF, of putting their main money towards this, of investing so much, in the Iron Dome, which got overwhelmed by like crappy little Hamas missiles, of upgrading to their super tech border posts that then got breached easily. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of people in Israel that see that this doesn't work and it's never going to work. The reality is that if Israel cannot find a way to integrate into the Middle East, into the region that it lives in, its fate will be the same as the Crusader kingdoms. Like, the only future Israel has is one where it is an integrated part of the Middle East.
Yeah, well, I guess unfortunately in the near term, it seems that the Biden administration is essentially willing to remake the Middle East and force everyone to capitulate and just to accept the Israelis at the point of a sword. I don't think the U.S. has that many bombs. I mean, we're talking about a massive region here with a lot of people who really, do seem to rally around the Palestinian cause. And so, everybody, make sure you subscribe to Brad's Substack. He's got another great one here. Supporting Israel doesn't make the U.S. safer. It never has. And so, one of the really odd things about October 7th was that Biden and the administration and the U.S. mainstream media all reported a lot of the claims, even the beheaded babies one. And we also had the Biden administration, backing the claims on the Palestinian Aid Agency, UNRWA, that 12 of their members participated in October 7th. And it now seems that narrative is cracking quite a bit, that Israel has not produced any evidence for that claim whatsoever. And so the U.S. has this undying commitment to Israel, and we believe and repeat all of Israel's propaganda points, even the ones debunked by the Washington Post, like there were Hamas tunnels under Al-Shifa, and that's why we had to invade there. So anything that Israel says, we just accept as the truth. And this has had a pretty major impact on the United States. I think a huge impact on Biden's foreign policy and his chances at getting reelected and what he was able to accomplish as president. So I don't know. Any thoughts to that, Brad? And everybody, recommend you check out the article I have up on the screen here. Supporting Israel doesn't make the U.S. safer. It never has.
Okay, thank you. So, my friend pointed this out, but I was saying, like, Israel is, like, people can't discuss whether Israel controls the U.S. controls Israel, is the tail wagging the dog and all of that. And, the reality is that, Israel is like America's drug-addicted child. My friend said that, Israel is America's Hunter Biden, which is a really good way to look at this. Like, it's, we have these things we feel we need to use it for, but it's constantly causing problems. It's like abusive towards us. It embarrasses us all over the world. It records and all sorts of stuff it shouldn't that ends up getting put on the internet. And so, it's really is a good way to look at it. And basically, I mean, we're just enabling this state that it's not good for either side. Like, this is what people miss, is that this relationship is extremely toxic for the U.S., Israel, and the world. And ending the special relationship is actually what is in the best interest of both countries. But, there's such an establishment. So another thing people would know if they read Haaretz is that AIPAC is actually really controversial in Israel, and it's widely thought by, at least by the professional liberal class, that AIPAC is, poisoning their country, is poisoning their discourse. It's not pro-Israel, it's pro-Netanyahu, etc. So, there's a lot of talk in Israel about how bad this is for Israel as well. And yeah, really the only thing to do is to cut them loose and let them to stand and fall on their own. And, they're much wealthier than their neighbors. They have a big population for the small country size. Everyone has military service. So, if after 75 years, and I don't remember the total number, I think we've given them $250 billion of aid since World War II or something like that. If they can't stand on their own, that's on them. We need to wash our hands of this awful situation.
Yeah. All right, Brad. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. If you got any final thoughts, feel free. And if not, just tell people where that, you want them to follow you, what you would most like them to go to and support. And you got a podcast too. I was just looking at your Substack and noticed it looks like you got a podcast.
Yeah, so my main thing I do is my writing at my Substack, which is the Wayward Rabbler, and then my wife and I do a podcast that is called Dispatches from Clown World, where we cover the most ridiculous stories, you know, of the circus that we live in. And then I am also on Twitter at Wayward Rabbler. And then, as you said, I have been writing for the Libertarian Institute as well. So those are the main places that you could find me. And, you know, I guess just the final thing that I would say is that be skeptical of everything when, you know, you're seeing media reports. And just always remember that you need to have a strong foundation so that you are not blown every which way by the latest piece of, you know, sensationalist propaganda that comes out, because you'll find if you have strong values that, you know, what matters the most is gonna stay the same regardless of, you know, which thing has the idiot public running back and forth at that exact time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for coming on the show today,
Thank
Brad.
you. Bye.